In a small town in rural Iowa, a family of 6 on a Sunday evening attended a Sunday school program. 2 friends of their young daughter ended up attending the program with them, and then going home that evening with them to spend the night. They fell asleep in 3 separate bedrooms, 2 adults and 6 children. When no one came outside the following morning, the neighbor grew concerned. This was 1912, and there were chores that needed to be done around the house. When a relative of the family went inside, he found a horrific scene in the downstairs bedroom. After the city marshal arrived and went upstairs, he announced that someone was dead in each bed. What happened inside that home on that evening in June 1912? Hi, I'm Mindy. Welcome to the Missing Link channel. Each unsolved mystery is just one missing link away from being solved. Hit that subscribe button so you'll be notified of our future videos and help us find that missing link. Before we get into the details surrounding the crime, let's take a look at the town and at that time period. The year was 1912. It was 2 months after the sinking of the Titanic. People didn't lock their doors at night. Everyone attended church weekly, if not more, and everyone knew their neighbors. The town was Villisca, Iowa. It was a close-knit community. It was described as a typical Midwest town until that evening. Now when you search Villisca, the first thing that comes up is the Villisca Axe Murder House. The year before the killings, the railroad had just come to town. Rail was a main way of travel during this time. Villisca was now a main stop on the railway on the way to Chicago. This was huge for the city of Villisca. The railroad was a huge advantage for the town. The town was flourishing. Many trains came through town every day. In 1912, the population of Villisca was around 2,500. There were many businesses lining Main Street. The town most likely would have had an influx of people and businesses due to the railroad. But that all changed on that June evening in 1912. The description on the website villisca.com tells this story. On a quiet residential street in a small town sits an old white frame house. On a dark evening, the absence of light and sounds are the first indication to visitors that this house is different from the other homes that surround it. Upon closer inspection, you'll notice the doors and windows are tightly closed and covered. An outhouse in the backyard suggests that this house does not occupy a place in the 21st century, but somehow belongs in another era or another story. A weather-beaten sign warns rather than welcomes. This is the murder house. The walls still protect the identity of the murderer or murderers who bludgeoned to death the entire family of Josiah Moore and 2 overnight guests on June 10th, 1912. Almost 108 years later, her secret continues to draw many visitors to her door. To some, it seems to be speaking. Visited by paranormal investigators have provided audio, video, and photographic proof of paranormal activity. Tours have been cut short by children's voices, falling lamps, moving ladders, and flying objects. Physics has confirmed the presence of spirits dwelling in the home, and many have actually communicated with them, and skeptics have left believers. Is the Villisca Axe Murder House haunted? You tell us. Your belief may be the key that unlocks the door to the Villisca Axe murder mystery. Villisca is within driving distance of where I lived. I was hoping to be able to go to the house and take a tour or do an overnight stay. But because of COVID-19, the tours are on hold. It is definitely on my list to do this summer. Hopefully the tours open back up. And if so, I will definitely do another video showing the house and the surrounding areas. Who were the 8 victims? The Moores were a well-known and well-liked family inside the town of Villisca. They had lived in that house on East 2nd Street for 9 years. Josiah, or Joe Moore, was known as one of Villisca's prominent businessmen. He married Sarah Montgomery on December 6, 1899. Joe had lived in the town of Villisca for 13 years. Sarah was born in Illinois, and she moved to Iowa with her parents and her sister in 1894. Joe and Sarah had 4 children. At the time of their deaths, Joe was 43, Sarah 39, their eldest son Herman was 11, their daughter Catherine was 9, their son Boyd was 7, and their son Paul was only 5. The eldest son Herman was described to be just like his father. In fact, he could often be seen by his father's side. Lena and Ina Stillinger were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger. They had 7 other siblings. Lena was 12 and Ina was 8. They actually lived in the country outside of Villisca. Let's jump right into that day. The story starts Sunday, June 9th, 1912. Lena and Ina both came into town that day to go to church in the morning. They then headed to their grandmother's house in town to spend the afternoon with her and enjoy lunch. That night, they were heading back to the Presbyterian church for the children's program. Before leaving for the children's program that night, Catherine Moore invited Lena and Ina to spend the night with them. Joe telephoned the Stillinger house around 6 o'clock that night to see if it was all right. The girl's older sister Blanche answered the phone, and when Joe asked to speak to her mother, she told him that her mother wasn't available. Joe asked if she thought it would be okay for the girls to spend the night, and Blanche told him she saw no reason why they couldn't, and that she would pass the note on to her mother. The Moore family and the Stillinger girls headed to the church. The children's program started at approximately 8 o'clock that night. Sarah was helping put on the program, and the Moore and Stillinger children participated in the program as well. The program lasted about an hour and a half. Afterwards, there was a social where everyone congregated. After the social, the Moore family and the Stillinger girls headed back to the Moore house. They had to walk about 3 blocks. When they left the church that night, no one knew that that was the last time they would ever be seen alive. They probably arrived home between 9:45 p.m. and 10 o'clock p.m. I can just picture them walking home those 3 blocks, or what the house was like when they returned home. I bet the kids were so excited from their program. They were probably all chatty and all giggly. I bet they were so excited after their performances. I know how loud my kids can get, and I only have 3. With 6 kids in the house that night, I imagine it was an entertaining sight. Joe always made a habit of locking the front door at night. He would lock the door from the inside and keep the key in the lock. I hope they had a wonderful night together before they turned in for the night. Joe and Sarah in their bedroom upstairs. The 4 more children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, fell asleep in their bedroom just down the hall. And Lena and Ina fell asleep downstairs in the guest bedroom. None of them would survive the night. The next morning, Monday, June 10th, the neighbor, Mary Peckham, got up bright and early. She had gone to bed about 8 o'clock the night before, and she did not hear the Moore family come home from church. Nor did she hear anything unusual during the night. In the early 1900s, people awoke very early. This was usual for this time period. They had animals to tend to, and they didn't waste any time throughout the day. Her house was approximately 50 feet from the Moore residence. She went outside at about 5 o'clock in the morning to hang laundry. By 7 o'clock, she grew concerned. No one had come outside the Moore residence. This was very unusual. She described the home as usually rambunctious. Usually at that time of day, Joe would have usually already left for work, and the kids would be outside doing chores. They would have usually already let the chickens out, tended to the horses, and milked the cows. None of this had been done. She described the home as unusually still. Sometime between 7 and 8 that morning, she knocked on the front door. There was no answer or movement inside. She tried to open the door, but it was locked. Mary let their chickens out and went to check on the other livestock, and she noticed that they were still tied up from the night before. She thought perhaps something was wrong, and they had all left the house before she had gotten up that morning. Mary phoned Joe's brother, Ross Moore. She spoke to Ross's wife and inquired of whether Joe's father could be ill. She thought maybe they headed there that morning, but she found out that wasn't the case. Ed Sully arrived next. He was an employee of Joe's at the store Joe owned. He had opened the store that morning and then received 2 phone calls, one from Ross, Joe's brother, and the other from Mary, the neighbor, asking whether Joe ever came to work that morning. When he told them that Joe had never come into work, he was asked to go to the Moore house and tend to the animals, especially the horses. He headed to the house, tended to the animals, and then headed back to the store. Ross, Joe's brother, came to the house as well. He attempted to knock on the door and got no response. He eventually started screaming into the house, trying to get someone's attention, but that didn't work either. Since the door was locked, he found a key on his key ring that unlocked the door. Mary stayed on the porch, and Ross went inside. He stepped inside into what they call a parlor room, which is what I picture as a sitting room. The guest bedroom was just off the parlor. When he opened that door, he saw an awful sight. He saw 2 bodies lying on the bed with dark-colored stains on the sheets. He immediately headed outside and asked Mary to find the marshal. He had no idea who was in that guest bedroom, but he knew something awful had happened in that house. Mary called Ed back at the store and asked him to find the marshal and hurry as fast as he could back to the house. Ed, the employee, Ross, Joe's brother, Mary, the neighbor, and the marshal, Hank Horton, all met outside the house. The marshal went inside the house, and he headed upstairs, and he found 6 more bodies in 2 bedrooms. When the marshal came out of the house, he told them that there was somebody killed in every bed. He relocked the house, and the marshal went to find the coroner and the sheriff. Ed, the employee, headed back to the store. The marshal went into town and found the doctor, a physician named Dr. Clark Cooper. He told the doctor to come with him, and when the doctor asked why, the doctor explained that the marshal looked absolutely frightened and that he said that Joe Moore and his entire family had been killed in their home. The doctor said that he arrived at the house at about 8:15 that morning. About that same time, the Presbyterian minister, Mr. Ewing, arrived as well. They entered the home together. Dr. Cooper said that they went to the downstairs bedroom first. Dr. Cooper's exact quote from that day was that all we could see was an arm of someone sticking out from under the edge of the cover with blood on the pillow. And I went over and lifted the covers and saw what I suppose was a body. Some entire stranger and a mere child at the back of the bed. I did not recognize them at all. Neither did any of the people, the others that were there with me. And we merely saw that they were dead and that they were the only 2 in the bed. And then we stepped out into the parlor. He then explained that they headed upstairs and they went into the parents' room. There was a lamp on the floor, which they moved out of the way. The lamp had been at the foot of the bed, and when he approached the bed, he pulled back the covers, and he saw Joe and Sarah in the bed. They were both dead. Then they went down the hall to the children's bedroom, and he said they just started counting children. How awful. I can't imagine seeing that sight. He said that the bedding was stiff, the blood was dry, and he estimated they had been dead for about 5 to 6 hours. Now remember, he said he arrived at about 8:15, so they would have been killed at approximately 3:15 or earlier. Other doctors later estimated that they had been killed sometime shortly after midnight. Dr. Williams was the second doctor to enter the home. He had the task of examining the bodies. Ed, Joe's employee, had actually found him on the street in town and told him that they needed help at the Moore residence. When Dr. Williams arrived at the scene, Dr. Cooper was just leaving the house and had stepped out onto the porch. When Dr. Williams entered the home, he said there didn't seem to be anything out of place. He headed to the parents' room first, upstairs. He said that the faces of the bodies had remained covered. He saw the lamp on the floor, and he said the chimney part of the lamp had been removed, and it was found underneath the dresser. It is my understanding that when the wick is turned back, it means that it will provide less light out of the lamp. The ceiling was low in the bedroom, and there were gouge marks in the ceiling, which they thought could be explained by the swinging of the axe. From these gouges, they determined that the murderer was left-handed. Joe was lying on his back, and his left arm was on his chest. The doctor explained that their faces were beaten in. Sarah was lying in bed next to Joe. In the kids' room, on a cot, was a little boy. He was laying on his stomach. His head was beat in, and his head was covered with an undershirt that was soaked in blood. In another bed in the same room was a little girl, and her head had been beaten as well. A little dress and a sheet was covering her head. It was covered in blood spatter. On another bed were two little boys. Their heads had been beaten, blood spatter everywhere, including the pillows, and their heads were covered as well. The ceiling in that bedroom had the same gouge marks from the swinging of the axe. Downstairs in the guest bedroom were two girls in one bed. One girl was a lot larger than the other. Their heads were beaten in as well. Ina was found closest to the wall, with Lena next to her. A lamp was found, similar to the other one, by their bed as well, and the chimney had been removed, just like upstairs. A little boy's gray coat was found over the little girl's head. On the floor was clothing and undergarments. The smaller girl was up by the pillow, but the larger girl was down farther in the bed. The larger girl, Lena, her nightgown had been pulled up and her undergarments had been removed. There was a defensive wound on her arm. She may have been the only one to wake up during this nightmare. There was also a blood stain on the inside of her right knee. Was it possible that the killer, after he had killed her, grabbed her knee and pulled her down farther in the bed? The doctor didn't believe that Lena had been sexually assaulted. At the time, the doctor didn't recognize the two girls downstairs. He thought one of them looked familiar, but due to the state of their appearance, he just couldn't be sure. Every person in that house, all 8 of them, had been brutally murdered. They were killed by Joe's own axe. He had kept that axe in the coal shed. They were bludgeoned to death, their skulls crushed in while they slept. What monster would do this? Why? Who would murder 8 people that way? Especially 6 children. Was one of the victims his target? Or was a murderer just an opportunistic killer? How exactly did the murders happen? The murderer possibly hid in the home before the family arrived home that evening. There were 2 cigarette butts found in the attic. Was it possible that the murderer had hid in the attic until the family came home, until they had fallen asleep, and then sometime after midnight, he killed them? Or did Joe forget to lock the house that night, and did the killer let himself in? It is believed that the killer entered the parents' bedroom first. He then killed Joe and Sarah. The murderer then went down the hallway to the children's room, where he killed Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. The children were struck probably about 3 times. They were very small, and their skulls very small. They had had such small heads that it wouldn't have taken a lot from the axe to kill them. The murderer then went back to the parents' room. At this time, the murderer knocked over a shoe that Sarah had left on the edge of the bed. This shoe must have been filled with blood from the first attack, and when the killer returned, he knocked the shoe over, and blood spilled onto the floor. The parents were struck so many times, possibly over 15 each. The most damage was done to Joe. I won't get into the details because they are really grotesque, but they were practically decapitated and unrecognizable. The murderer then went downstairs to the guest bedroom where he killed Lena and Ina. The axe was found propped against the wall in that guest bedroom. An attempt was made to clean the axe, but there was still blood that remained. A piece of a keychain was also found on the floor in the room. The murderer seemed to be familiar with the layout of the home. Had the murderer been inside the home before? Or had the murderer been in the home while the family was at the church and he looked around? Next, we will discuss some important details of how the killer left the home that morning. Number 1, every mirror and window in the house was covered. Every curtain was drawn or clothing pulled out of the dressers to cover up the windows and the mirrors. Why do this? In some cultures, they cover the mirrors so that you do not see yourself and focus on yourself, but instead focused on the people that are deceased. In other cultures, mirrors are covered to prevent the spirits of the deceased from getting trapped inside the mirror. Others believe that when someone passes away, it leaves a void, and an evil spirit can come and fill that void. The evil spirit cannot be seen by human eyes, but it can be viewed in the reflection of a mirror. So the mirrors are covered to prevent seeing an evil spirit. Number 2, the murderer also covered the heads of the victims with either a sheet or clothing. Why did he do this? There are various reasons. Some believe that the spirit leaves the body through the mouth. Others believe that covering up the body can prevent the odor from being as apparent. Another reason is that perhaps the murderer had a personal attachment to the victims, perhaps being sorry for his actions, or maybe he didn't want to see what he had done. Number 3, bacon. The coroner found a slab of bacon on the floor in the room where Lena and Ina were found. It was laying near the axe. It weighed nearly 2 pounds and was found wrapped in a dishcloth. Another slab of bacon, similar to that one, was found in the icebox. I honestly have no idea what the bacon means or why it was there. Perhaps the murderer had planned on taking it with him, or he forgot. There's other speculation online of what that bacon could be used for, but honestly it's disgusting and I have no desire to talk about it. Number 4, in the kitchen were 2 items. First was a pan full of water that had blood inside. Number 2 was a plate of uneaten food. Did the murderer wash his hands before leaving? After committing 8 murders with an axe, can you imagine how much blood would have been on him? He would have been covered from head to toe. I don't think a pan of water would have helped very much. Also, after committing these atrocious murders, did he make himself something to eat? Number 5, the door was locked when the neighbor tried to get in. No key was in the lock on the inside of the door, so the murderer must have taken the key with him and locked the door on his way out. News traveled quickly about the murders throughout town. It was a different time. When anyone made a phone call, the operator could hear your entire conversation. Plus, at that time, there were party lines, which means that multiple residences shared the same phone line. Anyone could pick up the phone and hear the conversations of their neighbors. There was no privacy on the phone at this time. People from all over town and the surrounding areas headed to the Moore residence that morning to see if what they had heard was true. There was no control over the crime scene. At least 100 people walked through the crime scene before the bodies were removed. One person even took a piece of Joe's skull and removed it from the crime scene to take it with him. He said he wanted it as a keepsake. Can you imagine all the evidence that they destroyed? Plus, who would want to look at the victims of that type of a crime? The Villisca National Guard arrived at the house about noon and secured the crime scene. By then, it was probably too late. These murders have remained unsolved for almost 108 years. It is not likely that they will ever be solved. The murderer died a long time ago, and he took the secret with him to his grave. Not much evidence, if any, was ever found. Things would be different, a lot different, if the crimes had been committed today. The crime scene would have been secured. Only certain people would have been allowed inside. Definitely not random people from the community. Evidence would have been collected. Fingerprints, blood, DNA. It all would have been collected for analysis. It is hard to blame the marshal and the sheriff from that time. They had never dealt with anything even remotely close to this type of crime. However, it is so sad to think that the mystery surrounding the Villisca Axe Murder House may remain a mystery forever. In the next video, we are going to discuss what happened after that day, the possible suspects, how someone could commit a crime like this, and how they got away with it for almost 108 years. Thank you for joining me here today. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more true crime videos, hit that like button. Remember to hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified of our future videos. And follow me on social media so you can see what other cases I am working on. If you have a topic you want to see discussed on this channel, feel free to send me an email. The email is listed below in the description box. As always, have a wonderful day. Watch out for each other and keep looking for that missing link. Love ya, and see you in my next video.